Hello, everyone, and welcome to Apex Ascend, where we teach lions how to rise and roar. You are a lion, so go out there and make your voice be heard. Let them know you're here. I'm your host, Rodney LaBruce, and today we're going to be pulling back the curtain on one of the biggest lies that's ever been told to the American people, and that is tax cuts for the rich going to help everybody. I know you've heard it. We've heard it before. Reagan in the 80s and Bush in the early 2000s, all the way up to Trump in 2017. But each time they called it bold. They said that it would be historic. They even said that it was going to unleash growth and opportunity and would lift all boats. But each time the results were the same. Wages flatlined, inequality exploded, and the wealth shot to the top, and the debt that was left behind all landed on our backs. Now Trump is back again, promising what he calls a big, beautiful bill. But let's be real. It's the same old scam with a new bow on it. We've seen it before. We've heard it before. And in this episode, we're going to walk through how past tax cuts widen the gap between the rich and the poor, what corporations really did with their profits, and why this next so-called beautiful bill would be one of the biggest transfer of wealth to the rich from the poor in U.S. history. So if you're tired of getting sold the dream while billionaires buy the future, then stay with me. Stick here. Because today, we're not just going to talk economics. We're going to be exposing economic deception. Let's get to it. Have you ever noticed how politicians love to overcomplicate the economy? Much like in general, as humans, we love to overcomplicate just about everything. Politicians look at the economy like it's some magical force that only they can understand, but let me break it down real simple. And here's it in a nutshell. When we invest in things that help everyone, like roads, bridges, schools, clean energy, childcare, public transit, when we invest in things like that, the whole country booms. Economy booms. People have jobs. Inflation is down. People have money to spend. That's because regular people get these jobs and earn this money and spend it back into the economy. That's called demand. And that is what drives growth. Demand keeps companies in business, keeps them adding employees. That's what demand does. But what happens when we do the opposite? When we give massive tax cuts to the rich and billions upon billions of dollars corporations? They don't spend it in the real economy. They hoard it. They buy back their own stock to inflate share prices. They sit on it in offshore accounts. They make themselves richer, is what they do. But that doesn't move the needle at all for us working people. So let's look a little bit at the receipts, starting in the 1980s. So in the 1980s, we had this thing called Reaganomics. And if you're old like me, you've heard of it. You remember President Reagan. So here's what happened. Ronald Reagan came into office in 1981, and he started to push an economic theory called supply side economics. And this is what most folks know as trickle-down economics. And the pitch of his was simple. Here's what he said. He said that if we cut taxes for the rich and for corporations, they'll have more money to invest. They'll create more businesses. They'll create more jobs, more innovation, and all that new wealth will trickle down eventually to the rest of us. In theory, that sounds nice. But here's what really happened. In 1981 and 1986, Reagan passed massive tax cuts. And the top income tax rate was slashed from 70% down to 28%. I know 70 sounds high, but if you go way back in history, the top earners were giving like 90% of their growth. But it was slashed from 70% down to 28%, and corporate taxes were also reduced. Capital gains, which is the kind of money rich people make from stocks and property, were taxed less than wages, far less than wages. As a matter of fact, what was his name? Warren Buffett actually said that he pays less in taxes than his secretary does. And we know that Warren Buffett is a multi-billionaire. And did the wealth from those tax cuts trickle down to the rest of us? No, not even close. Wage growth for regular workers basically flatlined. From 1979 to 1990, the average hourly wage, adjusted for inflation, barely even budged, didn't move. Meanwhile, you look at the pay of CEOs, well, those kind of exploded. In 1980, the average CEO made about 40 times what a typical worker made. By the end of the Reagan era, a long time ago, that ratio was close to 100 to 1. Much worse now. Income inequality took off like a rocket. The top 1% started taking a bigger and bigger slice of that national income pie. From 1980 to 1989, we looked and we saw that the richest Americans saw that their real incomes rose by over 80%, while at the same time, the bottom 80% saw almost no change at all. Even worse, some of them saw losses, factoring in inflation and rising costs. So while on paper it looked like they saw no change, in reality, they saw even a worse outcome through losses, factoring in inflation and rising costs. And here's the kicker. Reagan also weakened labor unions. He fired striking air traffic controllers, and he ushered in the age of deregulation, and that meant fewer rules for Wall Street and fewer protections for workers and more room for corporations to shift profits upward and costs downward onto the public. So if you were rich during this time, Reaganomics was a Christmas gift to you. If you were working class, you were told to wait for the trickle. That would never come. And guess what? It would never, ever come. Instead, the wealth stayed right where it landed, right there on top of all of us. And that era set the stage for the economy of what we have now, where working people hustle harder than ever, work more hours for less pay. And the richest few among us live in a completely different reality. Fast forward to 2001. Our beloved President George W. Bush, came into the White House. And he would roll out familiar playbook entries. He would cut taxes, especially for the wealthy, and promise that it'll boost the economy for everyone else. And just like Reagan, he said the same magic phrase: this will grow the economy, it will create jobs and more opportunities. But here again is what actually happened. Bush tax cuts came in two waves. It started with a cut in income tax rates across the board, including the top bracket. That was in 2001. And in 2003, it slashed taxes on capital gains and dividends. This is money the wealthy made from their investments, not actual work. So, all in all, who got the biggest slice, the biggest cuts? Well, that answer is easy. The top 1% took home about 38% of all benefits. Meanwhile, the working class Americans got a tax cut that was so small it often vanished due to the rising cost of health care and housing and gas prices. And what about those jobs that were supposed to come? Well, that didn't look very good either. From 2001 to 2007, Bush recovery years, the U.S. had the weakest job growth of any post World War II expansion. We added about 1.1 million private sector jobs in total over about 6 years. For context, Clinton added 22 million in just his 2 terms. So in 6 years, adding 1.1 million compared to in 8 years, adding 22 million. Let that sink in. And what was the price tag of all this? Well, these tax cuts to the wealthy blew a $1.5 trillion hole in the federal budget. And that's before we even get to the Iraq War and the Wall Street bailout that would later come, which would pile on even more debt. So here's the bottom line to the Bush era. Those taxes didn't pay for themselves, or those tax cuts didn't pay for themselves. They didn't spark any kind of economic boom. And they sure didn't lift up working people like you and me. Instead, we got an era of ballooning deficits, flat wages, and another surge in wealth inequality. And just like the 1980s, the money, all of the money, went upward to the pockets of the investors, the CEOs and hedge funds, and not to you and I, not to the communities. And then right on cue, if you remember, 2008, the financial crisis, Wall Street crashed, the economy, millions lost jobs, homes, retirement savings. But the Bush tax cuts, they were still on the books, still draining revenue, and still enriching people at the top, still enriching the people that caused the economy to fail in the first place. So while we felt the cuts, we felt lost jobs, lost revenue, lost homes, lost retirement savings, they still got rich. Now let's move on to 2017. By the time Donald Trump got to office, we'd already seen much evidence that this movie that we've been watching that promises a payoff at the end, that all of this wealth would trickle down eventually to the rest of us, we've already seen that movie twice. And we've seen that it did not work. But instead of learning from history, Republicans ran it back with the same kind of tax cuts and job acts of 2017. This was the biggest rewrite of the tax codes in decades. And surprise, it was just simply another gift to the rich. That's all. So when we look back at it, the corporate tax rate, which was at that time 35%, well, it dropped even further to 21%. Now, remember when I said that when Reagan started this, it was at 70%? These rich folks still crying about 21%. This was a massive windfall for big businesses. The top 1% got the lion's share of the benefits. Meanwhile, middle class and the working class families saw a little bitty tiny, small, temporary tax cuts. that would back then expire in 2025, this year. This year, it's set to expire. Those middle class, working class tax cuts that we've been enjoying over the last few years, well, those were temporary and set to expire. But the real scam, what did the corporations actually do with all their money? If it didn't trickle down to us, where did it go? Did they raise wages? Did they invest in workers? Did you see more profit sharing going on? No, across the board, you didn't. So what did happen? Stock buybacks exploded. So in 2018 alone, U.S. companies spent over 1 trillion with a T, $1 trillion buying back their own shares. And that would artificially inflate stock prices and executive bonuses. It was a Wall Street payday while Main Street got the leftovers. What does this mean? What are these buybacks? Companies have a finite number of shares available to the public. Let's say Microsoft, for instance, in their corporate papers, they say that they have 1,000 shares of stock available in their company that the public can buy. So you and we may, right now, I may be able to only afford one share. It's so expensive. But the public, you and I may go out and buy a share or two of that stock or of the shares available in that company, Microsoft. So in total, they have 1,000 shares. You buy one. I buy one. That leaves 998 left. Well, others purchase about 900 or so of those. Well, what these companies do whenever they have profits, if all of the 1,000 shares are already taken and the company has record profits for that year, well, what they would do is they would go out in the public and start to buy back those shares. Like, for instance, you bought one, I bought one. Well, they're going to go into the public and they're going to buy the one that you have and maybe even the one that I have. They start buying back these shares. So what does the law of supply and demand mean? If there's a demand for something with a limited amount of supply, the value of that something will increase. So if when they go out and start to buy back these shares, for instance, and you own one for $10, they buy your share for $10. Well, what does the rest of the market see? They see, oh my, people are buying shares in this company, in Microsoft. So that inflates the cost or the share price for the remaining shares. Now, just remember, Microsoft had profits and they bought back these shares at $10 a piece. Now, everyone else in the public sees that somebody is buying these shares. The share prices go up. What does that do to the value of what Microsoft now owns? They bought it at 10. Now they own like something that is valued at 12. So it artificially inflates the cost of that share, which is enriching their shareholders themselves, their executives who get these shares gifted to them. Y'all see how that works? Uh, it's, it's kind of complicated, but not really. So it was a payday. These U.S. companies spent $1 trillion in 2018 buying back their own shares. So the bulk of the tax cut windfall went to shareholders and not workers because wage growth barely moved. Job creation during the Bush years, Trump years, slower than under Obama. Investment in equipment and research and development, minimal at best. And just like Reagan and Bush, the national debt ballooned, skyrocketed. So Trump promised that the cuts would pay for themselves. Instead, the deficit shot up nearly 50%, even before the pandemic hit in 2020. And let's be real, 2017 tax cuts were never about jobs or helping working families. They were all about consolidating wealth and keeping the donor class healthy. Not the wealthy class, or not the working class, not the middle class, but the donor class, wanted to make them healthy. So let's wrap it up. 3 decades, 3 different decades, 3 different presidents, all with the same failed theory. Give more to the top, wait for the crumbs to fall to the bottom. But the crumbs never came. And if we're serious about building a real economy, one that works for everybody, we have to stop pumping money into boardrooms and start investing in classrooms, bridges, healthcare, housing, people. And don't let them fool you when they start talking about the debt and the national debt and not wanting to, they'll say that, the national debt is out of control anytime you start talking about giving money to classrooms and infrastructure. But in reality, that national debt booms under their watch because of the tax cuts and no money going back into the economy. One day we'll talk about the deficit myth in general. When we talk about the national debt of 34 trillion or 35 trillion or whatever it is right now, we'll talk about that and how that's a myth in the first place. But whenever the Republicans start talking about, we're spending too much, it's always when we start talking about investing in our people, in our infrastructure. But in reality, as we've learned under Democrats, whenever you invest in these things, classrooms, people, bridges, healthcare, housing, whenever you invest in these things, pour money into those things, the economy booms. Not through tax cuts for billionaires, because when they get their money, they just hold on to it. Not through Wall Street buybacks, but through justice, through jobs, through public investment. It's not complicated at all. But Trump is back. He's back. We talked about 2017. But now we have this big, beautiful bill. So after all of the damage in 2017, all of those tax cuts, Trump is teasing what's already passed through the House and is working its way through the Senate. Now, to be transparent, I seriously doubt that the bill is going to pass in its current form. Because in the Senate, there are some administrative hurdles that it has to pass before you even get to the bill itself. So, and I'm not going to go into details about that, but I seriously doubt that it's going to pass in its current form. But let's assume that it does or does pass in any way recognizable to what it is now. What do we have in this big, beautiful bill that Trump is trying to pass? There's no details, no text, no math. It's just branding. That's all it is. Regular people need to hold on to their wallets because this so-called bill is not about you. It's about locking in and expanding the single biggest transfer of wealth to the rich from the poor in American history. It's going to give a permanent tax break to corporations and the ultra wealthy. Now, when you look at the standard deduction that middle class like to use, that's expiring this year, has not yet been removed. When you look at the crumbs that were tossed to the middle class, the corporations are going to experience a permanent benefit. These tax breaks for the rest of us are temporary. Right now, it's expiring in 2025, this year. But the big, beautiful bill, should it pass, no guarantees, but should it pass, even those crumbs that we get are going to expire in 2028. So if he gets his way, if Trump gets his way, the rich parts are going to be permanent, and he's going to extend crumbs to the rest of us just long enough to win another election, or just long enough for the Republicans to benefit from some sort of tax break messaging to the public. So in translation, you're going to be paying more on everything you buy, while the billionaires who make their money off stocks and real estate are going to pay nothing at all. We might see about a $500 to $1,000 modest boost in our tax payments in a year, but the top 10% we're going to see about at least $12,000 a year. And the poorest among us, the poorest 30%, well, they're actually going to see a loss due to cuts in Medicaid and SNAP and other safety net programs. So that middle class gain is going to be slight to moderate, but temporary. The wealthy tax breaks are going to be permanent and pretty big. And the poorest among us, the ones who need it the most, they're going to see losses in the end. So this bill isn't beautiful at all. It's brutal, pretty much. It's a part of a long-running scam that the Republicans have put out about this trickle-down economy. We've seen it through Reaganomics. We've seen it through the Bush cuts and the Trump cuts the first time around, and this time he's not even hiding it. He calls it big, beautiful bill because he knows that deep down it's a big, ugly truth. So here's the bottom line. Every time they say tax cuts, the working people get the short end of the stick. Every time they say pro-growth, they mean growth for their portfolios, not your paycheck. Every time they roll out something like this and they call it big and beautiful, it's the same old trick with a new coat of paint. But here's what they did not count on. They didn't count on people like you and me paying attention. Because when we understood how the economy really works, when we call out the lies, when we recognize that none of these scams, trickle down or not, have ever worked in history, when we understand that anytime they push for deregulation, all that does is set us up for some sort of great economic disaster. Deregulation in the 20s led to the Great Depression. Deregulations in the early 1980s led to the Great Recession. Deregulation in the aughts led to the Great Recession in the 2008. Every time you hear deregulation, think in your mind, if they deregulate, then sooner or later, there's going to be a huge economic pay to recover. We're going to have to pay it in the end. So we don't need more trickle down. We don't need that. We don't need to invest in people who make all the money anyway. We need to invest in the people who make this country run. the working families, the educators, the truck drivers, the nurses, the caretakers, the entrepreneurs who aren't billionaires. They are the builders of the community. And if we're bold enough to name the problem, we're bold enough to change it. Don't let anybody tell you that, oh, there's nothing we can do about it. It's just how things work. If you've had enough of these sort of bills that come to sell you out, you're not by yourself. This is your moment. This is our moment. This is the moment in history where we tell our children and grandchildren and their children that we stood for something. We didn't sit idly by and just let these things happen. We shouted out from the mountaintop, we're not going to let this happen to anybody else again. Let's build an economy that starts from the bottom up, not from the top down. And let's do that now. Until next time, my name is Rodney LaBruce. This has been Apex Ascend, where we teach lions how to rise and roar. I want you to stay sharp, stay loud, and stay committed. Subscribe, share, let someone know about the podcast, and let somebody know that the real economy isn't complicated. It's just rigged. And we're here to unrig it and save our future once and for all. Thank you for listening. Till next time, I'll holler. Hey everybody, this is Rodney LaBruce. I am the host of Apex Ascend. That's the podcast that everybody's listening to, or at least they should. I wanted to just jump on and invite you to take the next step. Reach out to us and join the Unified Advocacy and Leadership Coalition. That's the UALC. Right now, we're building a movement that values truth, humility, and real solutions over all that viral noise that you hear and that's causing all of the outrage. Because at UALC, we work together to fight misinformation. We look to elevate those overlooked voices. And we also develop leadership rooted in empathy and evidence and not ego. So right now, while you have a moment, go ahead and go to LaBruceForCongress.org. That is LaBruceForCongress.org. Look for the tab that says UALC. Click it, read about it, and reach out to us. Whether you are a lifelong learner, a critical thinker, or just someone tired of all the noise, we want to hear from you because we want you to join the conversation. That's all I have today. Thanks again for joining me on Apex Ascend. If any episode moves you enough to make you think, go ahead and share it and reach out to us and share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.